All right, guys. So we have a little bit of housekeeping. There's a couple things that we didn't do in the other ones to link everything up. Previously, we created the physics debug system, the physics system, and the player control system, but we have not made it to a point where we could actually test those to see that they're being created. If I go ahead and try running the program, I should not be errored out, but it's not going to actually do anything. I'm still going to have a black screen. Okay, so we're on the right path. What we're missing, and if we look at our create body and our body generator, we're not setting the position. So that's piece number one. Our entity manager is not actually being called yet to create the entity, to spawn the entity. That's why it's still grayed out. So there's a couple things. So in our entity manager, let's fix this first. So we have two position vectors, but we made an error in setting this up. We declared them, we didn't really give them actually a value because we didn't create them. So we need to do new vector2, and then we're setting it to 0 inside. New vector2. And the reason for this, because I've already tested and debugged it multiple times, when we get to here, this and this, since it's only setting it to 1, this would be where we're actually initializing it. It's not giving, it's treating this as 0, and this is 1, and it's not giving us what we want. So then once it gets in there, it's not setting it correctly. Okay, so we can go into our body generator, and here right at the gravity scale we can set our position for when we create the entity. So bdef.position.set, and we're going to, now we have to think of the position. We want the center of the box 2D body to be at the point that we're saying. So if we're saying we want an entity to be created at 8, if our width of our screen is 16, then that's actually only the bottom left-hand corner of the box 2D body. So we have to do a little bit of math. So if we were, let me just open up the drawing tool so I can kind of draw out what I'm meaning. All right, so let's delete this. All right, so if I have a box 2D body right here, and I say I want it at position 8, 5, okay, that is going to be 8 to this point would be my 8, and then up would be up to here would be 5. So what I need to do is I need to find my x. So this would be my x and this is my y. I need to have my x plus whatever the dimensions of this is divided by 2 so that it will put it right there. And then I would need to do the same thing for my y. I would need to have my y position plus the dimensions by half, okay? So that it would put it right in the middle here. That's where we want the position for the box 2D to be, okay? So our position then is going to be using that vector 2, position.x plus dimensions.x divided by 2. And that's for our x direction. And then position.y plus dimensions.y divided by 2. Okay? That should give us the correct position that we're looking for. So we fixed that other issue that was plaguing us. This should be correct. Now if we go into our main game screen, we are updating the engine, but we have not actually created. Remember when you guys were doing this for Box 2D? We have not done that yet. So we have the system set up. We need to actually create the entity manager. So I'm going to create some more variables, and I'm just going to call this entity manager. So any players or characters that we need to hold on to, we can put there. So let's do private entity manager, and I want to be able to hold the player. So let's do player entity, and we're looking for Ashley entity, so that would be this one. And then I'll just call it player. Okay. And that's what we'll just do for now. So when we create, I'm going to do it after I create the systems. I want to create the entity manager. So entity manager is equal to new entity manager. And now we got to pass in a number of things. We need to pass in a reference to the Redbeard Run game. So we already have one that's called game. We need to pass in the world that we created, the batch that we're using. So I'm doing this.batch because that's what we're holding on to for that screen, which is just a reference to the batch that we created at the very start and a reference to the engine. Okay, so this now, after we do our Ashley systems, we now have created the entity manager, and we can use that to manage our stuff. So we could go ahead and do this in the show. And let's just do it with the player. So player equals entity manager dot spawn entity, and now we can start passing in our information. So it's case sensitive for the entity name, player, and then we could give positions where we want it to be. So I'm going to, since I am on my figures, the width of my screen is 16 and the height is 11, and I'm passing in for the main game screen that's looking for int. So I'm just going to do 8 and 5 and then see where we're at. Okay. Now for our game input, we do have A, D, W, and S, but we have not tested if that's set up because there's a couple things that we got to do. So let's go ahead and see that. We could see if our Box 2D debug renderer is operational, and if it's putting it in the right spot, that'll let us know if the entity manager is working kind of how we want it to. So I see it down here, but I am seeing it. So we know that we're doing our systems right, but now we've got to kind of debug some stuff. So I'm putting in 8.5. Let's start running down to make sure that we have in our entity manager that it's tracking that correctly. So we put those temporary vectors in as X and Y. Let's go ahead and log to the system so we can see what's going on. gdx.app.log. And this is my entity manager. Oops. Entity manager. Okay. And we're going to do temp position vector dot toString and print that out. Oops, that's supposed to be a comma. Okay. I also want to check that once we create this, the body, and we're calling that body component, I want to see that if those vectors as they're going in, if that's what we want. So we can start kind of tracking down. I passed in 8 and 5. That should be held in my int X and int Y. Is something happening that's making it change as it's going in. So entity manager. Let's do that one. I'm going to put some spaces. Let's do the dimensions vector because we put that in as 1.toString. And okay, so let's run this just long enough so we can see what that pieces are. Okay, so we just passed them. All right, so 8 and 5 is going in, and in the entity manager we have 8 and 5, so that's what we want, and 1 and 1 for our dimension. So we are passing in, so now we need to go into our body generator and see what's going on. So let's print off let's actually just print off what the body is. So gdx.app.log, and we're in body generator. And then bdf.position.toString. That's a comma instead. Okay. Okay, so in the body generator, remember it's doing the position plus the dimension divided by 2. So we should have 8.5 and we should have 5.5. So that's right. Okay, now let's see if it's holding on to that. And we could do that by checking in the main game screen and going to the render. So since I now already am holding an instance of the player, just so we can see if our stuff is loading up correctly, let's check. So we can do player. Now if we're trying to get, this is going to be long, but if we're trying to get that for the player, we use the tag. And then we are going to type player.getComponent, because now we're looking for an Ashley component. And so we can type in body component.class. And now we could actually pull the body from that and pull the position and then the toString and be able to print in the render what that body position is for that Box2D body, and see if that is at 8.5 and 5.5. So we have 8.5 and 5.5 when we created it, but now when it's rendering, it's at 0.5 and 0.5. So we're going to have to run and debug that a little bit to find out what the issue is. We're going to want to do that before we start trying to implement any type of controls, because you want to have where you're creating your entities to be very predictable. So I'm going to pause this. I'm going to go ahead and continue to try to debug, because I don't know exactly what that issue is yet. And then figure out where that is, so that when it does create it, it creates it in the exact spot that I want. All right, I realize where the mistake was. I'm setting the position here, but based off the shapes, I was setting a different position. And I was setting it only based off the dimensions, so that was 1 divided by 2, 1 divided by 2. That's why I always set that position in the wrong one. So actually what I need is I need this for this. That's doing the correct position. And then for a circle shape, it's the same thing. Now that makes sense. Okay, so I don't actually need this. And now if I run, we are centered. Okay. All right, so that is giving a correct position. Let's just make sure that my world center is right. Okay, so I don't need this anymore. I don't need to print unnecessary stuff. Main game screen, I don't need that in there. Okay, and in my entity manager, I don't need it. That's why it's helpful to put tags, because you can find where they are. Okay, so the issue then, and we set it up for WASD. We want to have movement. Now if I'm pushing A, D, W, S, I get nothing. Okay. So there's a couple of things that we can do to double check if this happens for you. The main one, though, before we start doing debugging, is that we never set an input processor for GDX. If you're planning on having multiple screens, we will end up having to use a multiplexer. But for now, really what we need is we just need an input processor that's meant to take inputs and then we are able to use them. So we're going to have to set that up when the screen is created, and we can do that when we're showing it. So once we actually come up onto the screen in our show method, this is where we'd want to do it. So GDX dot is that app? No. GDX dot input dot set input processor. Okay, and then we got to pass in what is doing the input. So let's do game input, and then let's run that. Yay, now it works. So there is our movement. We could tweak how fast we are moving when the keys are pushed. If I take my hands off the keys, so I'm holding, I lift up, you notice that he's still moving a little bit. That is because we are applying force to a physics body. So we still have a little bit of inertia, which that's okay. So the next thing that we would want to do is we're going to want to set up for being able to do collisions and for us to be able to create basically the level pieces. So that should give you enough that you're able to start kind of tweaking how you want your movements. From, let's say, just using the keys, adjusting that so you get more realistic type movements for what you want before we even bother starting to apply sprites. All right.